talk is, it's a story. There's no way that in 20 minutes, an hour, we're gonna go over everything that has to do with gentrification or how people define it or what it looks like. The picture on my slide, I won't even be addressing this project or this community, but it is a Chinatown CDC in Boston. And it was a picture that I took while I was back home in the summer and snapped a photo of it. But just to say that this is kind of more of a lived experience, places I've been during specific times in the past year. So to start off, we'll start with the kind of origins of the word gentrification. It derives from the word gentry, meaning the people of gentle birth, good breeding, or high social position. Sociologist Ruth Glass coined the term in 1964 to mean the influx of wealthier individuals into cities or neighborhoods who replaced working or lower classes already living there. She defined it by using London districts as her case studies. What stuck out to me from this quote was the process of gentrification, starting in districts and going on rapidly until all or most of the class occupiers are displaced. So for the sake of this conversation and the sake of this presentation, I have defined gentrification as development that causes displacement. It's a loaded term at best, and there's a lot of baggage associated with it, either visually or demographically, but for the case of this and my capstone project with reinvestment funds with the MSRD program, I think displacement is at its core. So my research motivations and questions going into my trip were several. What causes gentrification? Who causes gentrification? Who are the players? What are the effects? Are they good? Are they bad? Can they be both? And what does it look like? So what do we talk about when we talk about gentrification? So everybody I talked to, I interviewed architects, developers, and policy writers across in 5 cities that would answer these questions for me. And so redlining, for those who don't know, in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Act was enacted to relieve the urban foreclosure crisis following the Great Depression. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, was formed to work with local municipalities, realtors, and lenders to assess neighborhoods across the United States and develop residential security maps. The surveys graded neighborhoods and quite literally redlined poor neighborhoods, placing them in financial quarantine. As a result, American wealth gravitated outward from the urban core and poverty clustered moved inward. From the 1990s to present day, a shift has occurred in the movement and flow of socioeconomic class. We're seeing a shift in urban cores that are filling with upper middle class, while the core are moving outward, presumably by displacement. Many folks, including myself, until a couple years ago, didn't know that these existed. And I think it's important to know and understand that our federal government tried to create wealth by discriminating by people of color and immigrants. And so, of course, there's this kind of introspective question that's in my head the whole time of what role do I play as someone that wants to be engaged in the built environment, as a millennial, as a transplant, and then what role do we play as a field, as an architect, as you as our aspiring architects or architects, developers, and historic preservation industry people. So going forward, these are the 5 cities I went to. 4 out of the 5 I went to twice this past year, and Philadelphia was the only one I went to once. The other trips, incredibly, were all made possible by either MSRD, Urban Field Studies, part of the program there, and the SAC, School of Architecture, Graduate Government, small travel funds. So thank you to those 2 kind of funding sources as well. So we'll start in Oakland. I went there in June and then again in October for the Urban Land Institute Conference. I went to school in San Francisco, but I was really interested in the kind of the news headings I've been reading about Oakland recently. And all the places on the white maps are where I went, mostly through my June trip. You'll notice that a lot of them are kind of along those hazardous zones, the red-lined areas. But I'm only going to talk about one project today. You'll note Lake Merritt there. We'll come back to that in just a second. Adrienne Steichen, she's a Tulane alum and principal at Hyatalk Architects. She was put in touch with me by Cassius, and we got together with a group of her colleagues to have just a general conversation about their attitudes toward gentrification. And they talked and pointed out cranes in Oakland and high-rise development, because that hasn't been occurring, nothing over like 20 stories and or 10 stories in 20 years. And so that's what that looked like there. It said look for parking structures, because that's indication of all the tech companies and the people with nice cars coming here demanding parking in their luxury condos. And they pointed me to Jeffrey Levin. He's the policy director at East Bay Housing Organization. He has been advocating against a project that they were actually asked to design on Lake Merritt. So I went to and met with him that day, and it just so happened to be that night there was a city council meeting regarding this project. So this is Lake Merritt in Oakland, home to SOM's Christ of the Light Cathedral, and to the right is the city-owned lot, 12th Street parcel, that was under kind of hot debate over gentrification. So it was sold behind closed doors to market rate developers, for high-end luxury condos. And the deal was supposed to be made public and supposed to be offered to anyone that wanted to bid on it. And it was a private deal that ended up turning into a big lawsuit. So the City Hall meeting I tried getting into that night was shut down because there were so many people. So this is from a press that took this picture. But there was a huge turnout of civic engagement, civic participation, and a stand against a project that serves the people that have lived in Oakland for generations. And so the city, this is a headline kind of 1 month later, that Oakland offers the lot to affordable housing developers. And through a few months of kind of design charrettes, meetings, and post-it notes, for those of you who have had enough design charrettes with post-it notes, they had this design, and I thought, like, wow, this is so much prettier than the other one, but is this, the antidote to gentrification, is this a visual cue, or is it something else? So then I went to Chicago after my trip to Oakland, and I had never been here before. Oakland's a huge place. I didn't get to go to all the places I wanted to go, but I did conduct 2 on-phone interviews before then. First with Veronica Gonzalez, manager at Baker Tilly. She was also formerly employed at the Chicago Housing Authority. And Bart Lloyd, director of acquisitions and general counsel for COA. They have offices in Boston, Chicago, DC. They have work in DC and Rhode Island. And it was interesting because both of these people are certainly engaged and poised to discuss these kinds of issues, but they both talked about things I wasn't totally expecting. So Veronica wanted to talk about these visual cues and told me to keep my eye out for kind of new storefront awnings, nice restaurants in kind of low-lying areas. And she told me to check the bathroom fixtures when I would go into a new shop. And if they were nice or finished or had a working toilet lid seat, then it was a gentrified neighborhood for sure. And then Bart said he wanted to talk about Cabrini Green, which I didn't know or think about in terms of gentrification. It's a 500 high density and high poverty tore down building. I'll talk about it in a second. But the day I landed, I was kind of Googling, okay, gentrification news articles. And I like these dueling headlines here. So the blooming, it's like this really celebratory runners, bikers, strollers, and then, this is our enemy if this stirs fears gentrification. So I ended up going here with our good friend PJ, former Tulane alum and travel fellowship recipient. And he got in front of my picture to point out this apartment, this balcony on the other side of the 606. And this kind of these folks they're selling out already, cashing in on this new public amenity, kind of stretching across neighborhoods, but in turn increasing property values similar to the Highline. So I walked around in Bucktown. There's a Helvetica font advertising, really great, surely authentic empanadas, and then honey butter fried chicken over in an industrial neighborhood. And so I definitely started kind of thinking a little bit more about that when I went to other cities. But this one was interesting because I got to Cabrini Green, and I know that it had been torn down, but I wasn't expecting just a green grass field. And I think in hindsight, kind of thinking about what Barb was talking about, it's about displacement, right? if all these tenants were given Section 8 housing vouchers, but there's not enough housing stock built after this, then where do they go? And so I think understanding that this is policy, this is city decisions that need to be made in order to accommodate and house folks is an important lesson to take away. So next up is DC. There's water, I'm gonna have some water. So DC, my sister's been here for 10 years. I'm pretty familiar with it, but yeah, I had kind of a hard time figuring out like what's gentrified, what's not. It's because it's the nation's capital, because it has federal funding. I kind of ended up learning more about kind of the policies at play that the district has created itself, but also the federal programs that states and cities can use all around the country. So these white dots represent properties acquired using TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act, which we'll talk about in a second, but this is just in the last decade. The folks I talked to before and during my DC visits, David Bowers with Enterprise Community Partners, Lisa Hodges, a lecturer at Tulane University and formerly worked for, DC Housing Corporation, and then Drew Addis was the Executive Vice President of Housing Partnership Equity Trust, who manages different CDCs, thank you, all across the country. And then Mary Beth DiLorenzo, she's the Deputy Director of Sustainability and Administration at the DOEE, and worked at the DCHD, which I'll talk about, that enacted TOPA the first time around. This is just a summary of a timeline. I don't have the time to go over all of these, although that would be fun. That have been kind of created by the federal programs for what they're saying here, impact investing, but this is really about kind of equitable investment, filling a gap. And that gap kind of, in my opinion, was started by this, the 1930s residential security maps. So this is all the work that we've had to do, programs and policies we've created to compensate for these kind of discriminatory policies in the past. So TOPA, DC's first right to purchase program, has helped preserve nearly 1,400 units of affordable housing over the past decade, and is one of the district's key tools to help residents stay in their homes as housing costs rise around them. The program provides low interest loans to tenant groups that want to purchase, and in many cases rehabilitate the buildings when their landlord decided to sell. So without financial and technical assistance by the first right to purchase program, tenant groups really wouldn't be able to take advantage of the important right they have in DC to potentially purchase and preserve their housing when their apartment building is being sold. And this is still active today. This is 2014. Mike Kelly, former director of Department of Housing and Community Development, and Cassius, I forgot to ask what you said you rattled off as all those other things.
He was the director of the Housing Authority of New Orleans and also a professor at Tulane.
That was fun. I knew I had to ask you something before I started, but so I think this is pretty radical that our nation's capital has this really progressive program that's empowers anyone and everyone to participate in real estate development and take ownership over their kind of housing choices. So next, going forward in Philadelphia.